Terrific. Well, welcome everybody to today's local government education program entitled Federal Legislative Updates for 2025. It's brought to you by the University of Illinois Extension and the National Association of Counties, or NACo. My name is Mike Delaney, and I'm an Extension Community and Economic Development educator based up here in Ogle County in the Northern State Line region. I'd like to welcome everybody today. We'll begin with some quick housekeeping notes, familiar to most. Please note, if you'd like to activate Zoom's closed captioning function, there is a button at the bottom of the screen that will pop up with the label Show Captions. We will be recording today's webinar, and we'll be making it available on our Community and Economic Development YouTube channel. After the conclusion of today's presentation, registered participants will receive an email with the slides and a link to the recording of the webinar. If you didn't register, but somebody provided you the link to the webinar and you'd still like to receive the materials, that's perfectly fine. Just drop your email into the chat box at some point during the course of the presentation to let us know to add you to that follow-up list. As always, you're welcome at any time to pose questions in the Zoom chat space. We'll have a Q&A session following the main presentation where we will address those questions. Now we'd like to welcome back to this long-running educational series our presenter for today, NACo's Legislative Director for Agricultural and Rural Affairs, Owen Hart. Owen's responsibilities include advocating for county priorities in the agriculture and rural development policy spaces, analyzing legislative and regulatory activities, and planning and executing NACo's conferences and events. Owen holds a Master's of Public Policy from the University of Virginia and a BA in International Development Studies and Geography with a minor in Arabic from UCLA. So again, Owen, we'd like to welcome you and thank you for being here, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mike, and hello, everyone. Give me a moment to get my slides dialed up here, and then we can dive right in. Okay, Mike, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see that right there? All right, fantastic. Well, once again, my name is Owen Hart, and I serve as the Legislative Director for Agriculture and Rural Affairs with the National Association of Counties, or NACo for short. Great to be with you all today and couldn't be more excited to engage with all of you. First off, just want to thank the Illinois Extension team for the opportunity to speak with you all today. Extension systems are really an incredible resource, not only just to counties, but all local governments and residents, particularly in rural areas. And I think too often their work goes underappreciated. You all have a strong partner in the University of Illinois Extension. And again, I hope you all are seizing the opportunity to work with them moving forward here. So today I'm excited to share an update on the federal policy landscape here in DC for the coming year and how NACo is looking to capitalize on some of these opportunities to support rural residents and communities all across the country. So here's a list of the topics that I'll be touching on today. The topics I'm highlighting will have a rural lens given my work at NACo, and then given most of our audience today does serve rural communities. But in case you are from a more suburban or urban community, I should still have a fair amount of useful information here for you as well. I'll also have some time near the end of today's presentation to answer any questions that folks might have, and looking forward to engaging with you all that way as well. So before I dive into the bulk of today's content, just want to give a brief introduction to NACo for folks who may not be familiar. So NACo is the chief federal representative of America's 3,069 counties, parishes, and boroughs. And as the main representative of county government here in DC, we also, by extension, represent over 40,000 county elected officials and 3.6 million county employees. So NACo is driven by a fundamental belief that when we strengthen our local communities, we strengthen the country. It's our job, on the government affairs team at NACo to, of course, lift up the voices of counties and then ensure that we all have an equal seat at the table in the federal policymaking process. We have just over 2,600 dues-paying members that actively participate in NACo's programs and initiatives, and that includes 90 of Illinois' 102 counties, most of which have officials serving in some kind of leadership capacity at NACo. So while NACo primarily interfaces with the federal government, we also work closely with other local representatives like the National League of Cities, the National Governors Association, as well as county state associations all around the country. That includes our colleagues here in Illinois to advance shared priorities that can really strengthen local governments all across the board. I'm, of course, a member of NACo's government affairs team, but advocacy is just one aspect of what NACo does. We also have a significant research and support arm that carries out research on and for counties, promotes best practices, and then it creates opportunities for our members to engage with one another and with state and federal partners on the issues that are impacting their communities. Again, we got hundreds of great resources available on our website at NACo.org, and I'd encourage all of you to check out what we have to offer. So again, just a little bit more about the philosophy that guides NACo's work. So again, at NACo, we believe that counties and other local governments are really an equal partner in our federal system, along with our federal, state, and tribal partners. NACo's core driving belief is that when we strengthen our local communities, we strengthen the country. And it's our job, of course, on NACo's government affairs team to lift up those voices. If we can help strengthen counties to better serve our residents, we can make this whole system at all levels of government work better. So before I dive into specific topics today, I just wanted to include a quick overview of our top 10 advocacy priorities for the year. The policies you see here are a product of really countless hours of discussion and debate among our memberships and are ultimately decided on by our board of directors. Our goal here is to reflect really the biggest issues that unify all counties around the country and, of course, across partisan lines. These really serve as our guiding overarching principles when it comes to the policies that my team pushes for with our federal partners. And again, that's just a brief 30,000-foot overview of what the organization is currently working on when it comes to our advocacy. And we'll look into a few of these areas coming up here. So first up, I just want to recap where things currently stand on the flurry of executive action that we've seen out of the White House since President Trump's inauguration on January 20th. It's been a really busy time in Washington for sure, and the flurry of activity that we've seen out of the executive branch has really been causing quite the stir, not only here in town in DC, but all across the country. So I just want to begin by looking at the federal funding freeze that I'm sure many of you have heard about and its impacts right now. So to recap here, in President Trump's first week in office, the White House issued 6 executive orders to halt federal funding for programs related to foreign aid, the quote Green New Deal, and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, otherwise known as DEI. On January 27th, the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, at the White House followed up with a memorandum directing federal agencies to temporarily pause all activities related to the obligation or disbursement of federal funding assistance. That's a direct quote from the memo. The goal was to review programs that were potentially affected by those executive orders that you can see there on your screen under heading number 1. So while programs like Social Security and Medicare were initially exempt, the memo was really broad language, also wasn't very long, just 2 pages, and the abrupt implementation of the memo really created some significant confusion and operational disruptions across the federal government. Many organizations that receive federal funding were, of course, left uncertain about which programs were impacted, as were some of the federal partners that were in charge of implementing these programs. The freeze, of course, did have immediate consequences. Federal grant recipients, nonprofit organizations, state agencies, you name it, all across the country reported being blocked from accessing federal funds. Some of you on this call may have felt the initial effects within your organizations. And in response to the growing outcry, OMB issued additional guidance the next day, clarifying that the freeze wouldn't affect programs with individual recipients, including things such as rental assistance, nutrition programs, and farm assistance. However, these clarifications ultimately fell short of resolving that widespread confusion, in some cases making it worse. On January 28th, a federal judge in D.C. placed an injunction on that federal funding freeze until February 3rd, prompting OMB to rescind the initial memo on January 29th. Despite this, uncertainty has lingered. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt explained that while the memo has been withdrawn to address some of those misunderstandings, the administration would continue its review of federal funding allocations in keeping with those executive orders moving forward. Most recently, on February 4th, a federal judge extended that original court injunction, citing the ongoing challenges that many organizations are facing in accessing critical funds, which brings us to where we are today. So while the federal funding freeze is currently blocked by court order, there is still considerable uncertainty surrounding the situation. The administration's actions here have ignited a larger debate over executive authority, congressional control of federal spending, and of course, the broader implications for billions of dollars in federal funds. It's very likely that we'll see some federal court cases resulting from this that will have lasting effects on federal funding processes and the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. Certainly an issue we'll need to watch closely moving forward. So we've also seen many other executive orders that may impact local governments moving forward here, particularly those in rural areas. Again, group these into several buckets to kind of break down the main categories of EOs that we saw. in the last couple of weeks. The first bucket of executive orders touch on energy production. So again, the president has placed a heavy emphasis on opening up public lands and offshore waters for oil and gas production, and then streamlining the permitting process for oil and gas projects. We can expect these orders to potentially build on the already strong position of U.S. oil and gas, which currently leads the world in terms of production levels and has so for the last 3 years or so. While we'll need to see how these orders are implemented by agencies, we could potentially see some significant economic and jobs benefits in communities across the country with existing or potential capacity for oil and gas production or related industries. The next bucket here, the president put forward a regulatory freeze for 60 days, which would restrict the issuance of any new rules and regulations while the new admin takes time to review its strategy on deregulation. This is certainly in keeping with previous administrations that usually see some kind of halt on its activities when they first come into office. In a similar light, the president also placed an indefinite hiring freeze on the federal civilian workforce with key exceptions for the military, immigration enforcement, and homeland security. This will likely be followed by some additional executive action to downsize the federal workforce in the months ahead, some of which we've already seen with Elon Musk's work through the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. It'll be important to watch how this impacts the federal workforce outside D.C., such as in county farm service agency offices and USDA inspection facilities, where employees are already stretched pretty thin. And of course, we'll continue to monitor that situation moving forward. Lastly, the president also signed a whole slew of executive orders to implement an overhaul of the nation's immigration system, including ending birthright citizenship, boosting efforts to detain and deport undocumented immigrants, and then pausing refugee admissions. A significant chunk of the nation's undocumented population does live in rural places. Reportedly, half of the nation's agricultural workforce is also undocumented, so it's safe to say that we can expect some disruption in many rural communities, particularly those with significant agricultural sectors. So again, a lot is up in the air right now with the first couple of weeks of the Trump administration. We'll certainly be continuing to track these developments moving forward. And we're looking forward to working with the administration to make sure we can get some more clarity on these rulings and executive orders. So moving on, let's shift over to Congress to take a look at where things stand, first with the 2025 appropriations process and reconciliation. So as a reminder here to set the stage, fiscal year 2024 funding is set to expire on March 14th, 2025, following the passage of a continuing resolution in December 24, which extended funding to that March deadline. Additionally, the Treasury Department hit the $31.4 trillion debt ceiling on January 19th and is using extraordinary measures, which is a formal process, to cover financial obligations accrued by the federal government. These measures are expected to run out by June 16th, 2025, which is creating additional pressure for Congress to act on the debt ceiling. In the coming weeks, Congress must decide how to address fiscal year 2025 appropriations moving forward here. Options here include introducing and passing all 12 federal appropriations bills by March 14th, passing another short-term funding patch, again called a continuing resolution, which will be either a short-term patch or a full-year patch, or utilizing the reconciliation process to combine appropriations with some other legislative priorities that Congress is looking to pass this year. Of course, that seems to be the preferred path for Republican leadership at this time, which has control over both chambers of Congress. As a reminder for folks who may not be familiar with reconciliation, the reconciliation process allows budget-related bills to pass the Senate with a simple majority rather than a 60-vote threshold, which bypasses the threat of a filibuster. This makes the reconciliation a really powerful tool for advancing spending, revenue, and debt limit changes. Of course, if no agreement is reached on federal funding by that March 14th deadline, we could see a shutdown of the federal government. Again, between then and now, Congress faces some significant challenges in this process. Divisions within the Republican Party are, of course, creating roadblocks here, with some members pushing for deep cuts to entitlement programs, while others are advocating for a more measured series of spending reductions. Lawmakers must also balance these fiscal goals with priorities such as extending tax cuts, raising the debt ceiling, and potentially increasing defense spending, all under some really tight time constraints. To make matters more complicated here, Republicans hold really narrow majorities in both the House and the Senate. In the House specifically, the two-seat Republican majority is the narrowest majority since the nation has had 50 states, to put that in perspective. There are, of course, dozens of Republican lawmakers who've never voted for a spending bill in their time in Congress, which means that any spending bill that Congress considers, at least in the House side, will require a certain degree of bipartisan support, which is complicating this issue, including that rift between more hardline Republicans and their more moderate counterparts. So, of course, the stakes here are very high. Congress has less than 6 weeks to act, not only to just fund the government and avoid a shutdown, but also to address that looming debt ceiling crisis. Of course, it's clear at this time that divisive action in the coming weeks is essential to maintain government operations and fiscal stability, and we'll be continuing to monitor this situation into the future here. So again, I mentioned this a little bit before in the appropriations section. Other than, of course, passing a budget for fiscal year 2025, tax reform is the next item on Congress's to-do list this year. So as many of you know, one of the signature legislative wins of the first Trump administration was the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. That bill expires on December 31st this year, setting up a major negotiation in Congress over a potential new tax package. President Trump and congressional Republicans will look to extend or permanently authorize many of the provisions in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, potentially as a component of a reconciliation package alongside the 2025 budget that we previously discussed. So here's a list of a few of the items important to local governments that we saw in the 2017 tax law. This includes lowered marginal rates for most taxpayers, an expanded standard deduction for both single filers and joint filers, the imposition of a $10,000 cap on the state and local tax deduction, or SALT, which was previously uncapped before 2017, a new tax credit for private investments in low-income communities, an expanded child tax credit, which was subsequently increased in the American Rescue Plan, or ARPA, in 2021. So all of these provisions are set to expire at the end of the calendar year if Congress doesn't pass a new tax package before then. So here's just a slide to kind of lay out what counties are looking at right now as far as our priorities go. You can really group these priorities into two buckets that really serve as our North Star in any potential tax package this Congress. First, we're of course looking to shore up tax reforms that can support county government operations. This includes restoring that SALT deduction and preserving the tax-exempt status of municipal bonds. And second, we're looking to secure reforms that can help our residents directly, such as extending the expanded child tax credit, restoring the low-income housing tax credit, extending the new markets tax credit, and then creating a new single-family home ownership tax credit. Just a few of our priorities here. So now, of course, any tax reform in this Congress, including the clean extension of the 2017 tax package, is projected to cost $4.6 trillion over 10 years. Again, that's just if you extended the 2017 tax cuts. To offset these costs, lawmakers may consider new revenue sources for the federal government, including limiting or eliminating the tax-exempt status of municipal bonds. As many of you know, this would be a really significant blow to local governments all across the country. Municipal bonds really are the cornerstone of how counties and our local government partners finance some critical infrastructure projects. That includes roads, schools, hospitals, more, you really name it here. Eliminating their tax-exempt status would increase borrowing costs, reduce infrastructure investment, and of course, strain local budgets, especially for small and rural communities. Counties, we like to say, are really built by bonds, and protecting the tax-exempt status of muni bonds is essential for our ability to serve our communities effectively. If this is something that really resonates with you, we encourage you to spread the word about the importance of preserving this tax exemption with your lawmakers. To learn more about county priorities for tax reform this year, you can always scan that QR code on the right side of your screen for more information here. So next up, let's discuss a policy area, of course, near and dear to my heart as the Ag and Rural Affairs Director at NACo, the 2025 Farm Bill. So I'll start today in this section by just giving a brief rundown on the Farm Bill for folks who may not be as familiar. The Farm Bill is a $1.5 trillion legislative package that, in addition to its role in setting federal agriculture policy, also authorizes a whole suite of programs that help counties make really critical investments in our communities. This includes things from infrastructure to nutrition, conservation, economic development, you name it. I've included a few key statistics here just to highlight how important the Farm Bill is to folks all across the country. Important to note that the Farm Bill really impacts all Americans, regardless of your zip code, whether you live and work on a farm or you live in the heart of a city. You'd really be hard-pressed to find a piece of legislation that is more significant to the average American's way of life. So on this slide, I've just listed out a few of the ways in which the Farm Bill directly or indirectly supports county governments in serving our residents. First among these is the Farm Bill's role in authorizing the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP. In most states, counties play a major role in administering SNAP in the communities we serve in partnership with our state governments. SNAP provides benefits to over 40 million county residents, and in 10 states, counties actually directly administer SNAP in their communities. Some other important Farm Bill programs to counties include programs that support rural development, including infrastructure and community projects. This only makes up a tiny portion of the Farm Bill's funding, but to our rural communities, these programs really are lifelines for our residents. We're also highly supportive of the Farm Bill's conservation title and the programs authorized therein. Counties are often project sponsors or partners with local landowners and farmers to carry out these kinds of conservation projects, usually run by USDA, that help protect our natural resources. Maybe less important to Illinois, but also important to stress here. There's also a number of key programs under the Farm Bill's forestry title that are crucial to local governments with public lands in their jurisdictions. These help us partner with the federal government to carry out joint land management projects to keep our forests healthy and, of course, mitigate wildfire risk. So to just zoom in on one area of interest for counties, let's take a look at the Farm Bill's rural development programs. So RD programs don't gather the most headlines when it comes to the Farm Bill, but they are, of course, incredibly important to rural communities. I'm sure many of you here work with USDA rural development and are well acquainted with these programs. The chart here shows us that since 2012, USDA rural development has provided over $380 billion in funds for nearly 2 million projects across rural America. These support projects that help counties deliver services to residents, maintain rural water systems, build out rural broadband, and of course, develop local economies and build jobs. The vast majority of these investments, with the notable exception for some reason of the rural housing programs, are directly authorized through the Farm Bill every 4 to 5 years. So that brings us to our current moment. Where are we now with negotiations on the Farm Bill? Well, as many of you know, if you've been tracking this space, we are on the 3rd year of our attempt to reauthorize the Farm Bill. I'm personally really tired of changing the dates on our resources and hope they get it done this year. Last year, the House Ag Committee was able to advance a full Farm Bill out of committee, actually on a bipartisan basis, but wasn't able to move the bill on the House floor. The Senate, their counterparts, were even less productive. While the Senate Ag Committee was able to introduce bill text in December last year, they weren't able to move it through committee at all. So after being unable to get a bill done last Congress, lawmakers yet again extended the 2018 Farm Bill to September 30th, 2025, the end of the fiscal year, for the second time in 2 years. So the big question now is, can lawmakers finally get it done this year? Of course, on paper, a Republican majority in both chambers and in the White House should bode well for a Farm Bill, particularly since the House and Senate Ag Committees have a fully formed bill from last Congress to work off of. However, lawmakers will need to work through partisan policy disagreements on the need to shore up the farm safety net and ongoing calls to trim down federal nutrition programs authorized in the Farm Bill, such as SNAP. We're expecting the Farm Bill debate to really kick off in earnest sometime this summer once Congress hopefully wraps up reconciliation and tax reform. In the meantime, would encourage all of you to reach out to your own lawmakers, share how the Farm Bill impacts your communities. Again, the local perspective here couldn't be more important to make sure we get a Farm Bill that really supports rural communities. We also put together a single resource hub for all of our Farm Bill advocacy on NACo's website. This is really a one-stop shop for legislative updates, all of our Farm Bill resources that I highlighted, template letters, stats, and a whole lot more. You can check out that resource hub through the QR code there on your screen. Moving on here, let's touch on an area that I think will see some bipartisan movement this year, which is, of course, rural healthcare. So when we think about rural healthcare, there's a whole range of factors that make providing healthcare in rural areas distinct and often more challenging than in urban areas. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir to many of you here. Many of you know that rural residents face lower life expectancies on average than urban residents, and one of the major reasons for this involves challenges in accessing affordable and reliable healthcare. Just a couple trends to highlight here. First, rural areas are losing capacity for specialized care, and especially from maternal care with things like hospital obstetric units, which impacts not just outcomes for mothers and infants, but also makes it harder to attract and retain young families in many rural communities, which are really the lifeline for rural workforces. Rural hospitals are also forced to close or scale down their operations when they're faced with low caseloads and poor reimbursements. The next one here is obvious. Rural folks are at a disadvantage with healthcare access simply because of geography. Even if a small town has a healthcare facility, by nature of living in rural areas, many residents experience longer travel times just to access basic medical care, which is particularly impactful if you're challenged when it comes to your mobility. Lastly, of course, rural families often have a more difficult time accessing the right insurance options and are much more likely to rely on Medicaid and CHIP for coverage. These are just some of the major trends we're following here at NACo, but this certainly is not an exhaustive list. And I'm sure many of you are struggling with these issues and others in your own communities and aren't necessarily reflected here on this slide. I'm now going to zoom in on two particular rural healthcare challenges related to rural hospitals and then rural emergency medical services, or EMS. So first up with rural hospitals. Of course, it's no secret that rural hospitals across the country are in dire straits right now. Hospitals are facing some deep structural challenges to their economic models in recent years, and many are really struggling to remain financially viable in our current environment. Over the last 13 years, we've seen 195 rural hospitals eliminate inpatient care. Almost 100 of these hospitals have closed completely all around the country, including many in Illinois. When a healthcare facility in a rural community closes, that can have a really devastating impact on a community. Hospitals are often anchor institutions in rural communities and big economic drivers and job creators. And not only are residents losing out on access to healthcare, but we're also losing high-paying jobs. Of course, the underlying reasons behind this trend are complex, but a few reasons we've seen have emerged. That includes low payment rates from private insurance and Medicaid, compounded by increasing costs for medical care. And then, of course, a critical shortage of trained healthcare professionals in rural areas. So while federal support provided during the COVID-19 pandemic did help staunch some of these losses, the support was temporary, and we're seeing the downside impacts of that now that many of those programs are expired. So that brings us to the second rural health topic I'll discuss today, which is rural EMS. If you live out in a remote area, sometimes an ambulance is the only guaranteed medical care that you're guaranteed to receive. This makes EMS providers a really essential part of healthcare infrastructure in rural counties. That being said, EMS providers do struggle with a number of challenges in providing care in rural areas. First among them is how EMS services receive payment. So first, EMS providers are primarily reimbursed for their services when they provide transportation, either from the place of injury to a healthcare facility or from one facility to another. This doesn't take into account on-scene care that they may provide to a patient. This works all right in urban or suburban areas where call volumes are high enough to guarantee enough payments. But in rural areas, populations are often too low to make this model sustainable. Now, the demographics and geography of rural areas is also a major obstacle here. Of course, rural populations are older on average than urban populations, which necessitates more care. In turn, many EMS providers rely on volunteers to staff their services. And as rural America ages, volunteers are harder to come by. Lastly, of course, the sheer distances that EMS services must travel to deliver care is another logistical obstacle that limits the capacity of providers and increases costs for them as well. So here's a list of kind of 4 key priorities that are guiding NACo's advocacy on rural health this Congress. This is still an emergency environment. We're still waiting to see bills introduced right now, but we do think we're going to be able to see some action on a bipartisan basis across all 4 of these priorities here. So first, of course, we need to fund rural health programs by supporting the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy at or above $364 million, which was the FY 2024 funding level. This funding sustains vital initiatives like expanding access to care in rural communities and then providing technical support for rural hospitals. Second, can't stress this enough, it's crucial to sustain Medicaid and Medicare for rural areas. Rural hospitals and EMS providers rely heavily on these programs for reimbursements, but often these reimbursement rates are too low to remain sustainable. We're asking Congress to protect Medicaid funding, increase reimbursement rates for rural EMS providers specifically, and then reform Medicare to eliminate that urban-rural payment disparity that we often see across the country. Third, we're working to incentivize rural healthcare professionals staying in rural areas. So addressing workforce shortages here is, of course, critical, and we're urging Congress to implement tax incentives and expand programs like the National Healthcare Service Corps that keep folks in communities to serve our residents. Reforms to graduate medical education will also hopefully help to increase the number of primary care providers in underserved areas. And finally, we need to get creative when it comes to the models of healthcare in rural communities, and this includes expanding rural telehealth. Telehealth really has provided a lifeline for rural communities. Of course, it's not an equal equivalent to in-person care, but for many folks, it does bridge the gap they need to get the healthcare they require. And we're calling for extended Medicare reimbursements, expanded outreach grants, and support for rural health research and development programs, as well as rural telehealth. So by addressing these priorities, we're hoping that we can really strengthen rural healthcare systems and improve outcomes for rural residents all across the country. So moving on to our next topic here, we're looking to focus on disaster resilience in 2025. Of course, I know a big topic in the Midwest, including Illinois. So first off, it's important to note that all disasters begin and end at the local level, with local officials on the front lines of disaster mitigation, response, and recovery. Last year, nearly 900 counties received at least one federal major disaster declaration, and many often face multiple disasters annually. That number is only increasing as disasters become more frequent and more severe, and thereby more costly to deal with. Counties are not just stakeholders when it comes to disaster resilience, but also really important intergovernmental partners. That also goes for our municipal partners as well. We share the responsibility of protecting our nation from all types of disasters, yet we're also the level of government most reliant on property values for revenue, which makes our involvement in disaster resilience even more vital. So we need to protect our communities. So to just strengthen disaster resilience, we can look at this policy area from three different perspectives. First, mitigation, and then response, and then recovery. So for mitigation and preparedness, we're exploring locally led practices and multi-sector partnerships that can reduce disaster risk before a disaster actually takes place. We're also seeking better federal partnerships, such as direct technical support, reduced administrative burden for federal disaster programs, and then enhanced collaboration between the federal government and county governments before a disaster takes place. During response efforts, of course, it's critical to enhance the framework for collaboration among federal, state, tribal, and local partners, and that ensures transparency and trust, which improves the overall effectiveness of disaster response. And finally, when it comes to recovery, we need really to think about streamlining programs, and that includes increasing transparency on reimbursements to counties, faster assistance to help impacted communities recover more quickly. Again, these improvements are really essential to reducing administrative burden and then supporting long-term recovery efforts. So with all that in mind, this Congress, counties are looking to work with lawmakers to advance priorities like reauthorizing and reforming the National Flood Insurance Program, increasing transparency in FEMA's public assistance program, and then creating a universal disaster application for residents to make it easier to access federal disaster resources. So I'll also note a new initiative that we are just now standing up this year, which is our Intergovernmental Disaster Reform Task Force. This task force is leading efforts to address inefficiencies in our federal disaster system, bringing together county officials and other local partners from all over the country. And over the coming years, the task force will work to develop solutions that enhance disaster mitigation, response, and recovery at all levels of government. It's a really exciting initiative, and I'm looking forward to see what they can come up with myself. Of course, to get this done, counties do need strong partnerships with the new administration, Congress, and then other intergovernmental partners to reform some of these longstanding inadequacies that we see in our federal disaster system. That, of course, requires elevating national awareness of the roles and challenges that local governments face in protecting communities from natural disasters. And we're hoping that this task force will be a powerful vehicle to do so. So as my last topic I'll highlight today before we move into questions, I just want to touch on a newer policy area that we've been tracking at NACo relating to, of course, permitting and land use, and then farmland preservation. So a major challenge that we've seen, particularly in the last year or two, is the growing issues that rural communities are facing with increasing rate of renewable energy development in rural areas, and often the negative impact that's been having on farmland. Before I touch on that, though, just want to run through permitting reform priorities real quick and what we might see in Congress this year. So, of course, annually, counties invest over $130 billion in public works, and oftentimes these investments are slowed down or maybe more inefficient by federal permitting processes stemming from regulations from the National Environmental Policy Act and other federal regulations. We're looking for opportunities to streamline these federal regulations to make sure that it'll be easier to get to these programs shovel ready and so our residents can use them. Of course, our priorities here are limiting federal preemption of local authority over land use decision making, and then increasing meaningful consultation with local governments through the planning cycle for projects here. So moving on to the issue I highlighted earlier, as many of you know, the U.S. has been losing farmland at a pretty astounding rate over the last few decades, and that's only continued to accelerate recently. Between 2001 and 2016, More than 11 million acres of U.S. farmland were converted to non-agricultural uses, and increasingly a major source of this loss is from renewable energy development, and particularly solar. Wind also plays a role here, but it has a much more limited footprint than solar and is able to coexist with agriculture much easier. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, market demand for solar energy development is projected to require an additional 10 million acres of land by 2050, with 90% of this expansion expected to take place in rural communities. In turn, the American Farmland Trust, a major player in this space, reports that 83% of this new solar development will occur on farm and ranch land, with nearly half impacting prime, the most productive farmland. Local opposition has had a big effect on the state of renewable energy deployment nationwide, and according to the Department of Energy, 1/3 of utility-scale wind and solar applications submitted over the last 5 years were canceled, while half experienced delays of 6 months or more. County officials, other local government officials are understandably worried about this trend. The loss of productive farmland can have a long-term negative impact on local economies, and in turn, the benefits from these projects often don't remain in the community once construction is completed. Right now, we don't really have much in the way of federal guidelines to ensure that these projects are following best practices, which of course is a major contributor to poor outcomes on solar developments. At NACo, we'd like to help our members navigate these issues related to solar development, and if we can equip our members with the tools that they need to ensure that these projects can benefit county residents, we believe we can ensure better outcomes in the long run on solar development that will allow these projects to move forward without losing our most valuable and productive agricultural land in the future. I know this is a hot topic in Illinois, and I would, of course, look forward to hearing many of your thoughts on this issue here. So, of course, NACo is just now in the early stages of our work in this space, but we've been able to put together a roadmap for where we'd like to see this policy discussion go moving forward. First and foremost, we'd like to see incentives and guidelines put in place to make sure that solar projects are sited on the existing built environment and then marginal farmland to minimize the impact on prime agricultural land. As this discussion unfolds, we don't want to see policymakers try to cut out local governments from decision-making on renewable energy siting, and we believe that keeping local governments at the table will help to ensure that these projects remain politically sustainable in the future. Counties are also encouraging the adoption of community benefit agreements, or CBAs, to ensure that local communities receive direct benefits from energy projects, such as new tax revenue, infrastructure investments, or local jobs. We'd also like to see new resources to encourage research into how we can make solar more compatible with existing agriculture. There's certainly successful examples of this to draw on, but in order for this to be viable, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Of course, this space here is generally called agrivoltaics. It's very exciting, but it's certainly in its infancy, and we want to see more investment made in that space. Lastly, we need to expand educational opportunities for community members on solar and its relationship to agriculture. This is an area where I think extension can play a big role by helping local populations understand the implications of energy development, the benefits they might get from energy development, and then, of course, how to participate in the planning process effectively. Again, we're just starting this work now and would love to get more folks' thoughts on this in the future. I would love to hear any ideas that folks might have if they want to engage in this issue alongside county governments. So here's a few marker bills that we were tracking in the 118th Congress related to solar and ag preservation. The bill titles you'll be able to see are on the top row of this table, where you can see what they actually do in the rows below on the left side. You see a variety of policies being put forward here, ranging from defining and encouraging the adoption of best practices on solar siting to protect farmland, all the way to authorizing new research efforts into the impacts of solar on ag land. We're hoping to see a few of these ideas included in the final Farm Bill package, hopefully sometime this summer, and looking forward to working on this issue more with our congressional partners moving forward here. So I know that was a lot of me talking to all of you, and I appreciate your patience here and your attentiveness. So I'll go ahead and wrap up there. You can see my contact info on the left side of the screen. And if you would like to get a hold of me about any of these items that we discussed today, please don't hesitate to reach out. Of course, thank you for all of you for your time and attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have. Before that, I'll turn it back to Mike here.
Great, terrific. Thank you, Owen. You're right. Again, fire hose mode with all that information, but these are the times we're living in. So there is one question from Susan. She notes, it's my understanding from talking with our rural development representatives that they currently have very little grant monies available nationwide. For example, for community facilities projects, because congressional spending allocations come from USDA RD funds. Loan funds are available, but grant funds for small rural communities and county projects are very limited.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Unfortunately, a big trend we've seen recently when it comes to specifically the community facilities program is that much of that funding has gone to congressional earmarks, where your congressional lawmakers are the ones directly deciding where those investments are going. In the future, we'd love to see, first of all, just more robust funding for the community facilities program. It's an incredibly flexible program, really great asset to local communities to really meet them where they're at with their development needs. Congressional earmarks are great, and we encourage people to reach out to their lawmakers with this. But if we also have some discretionary funding authority with USDA RD state directors, that could also help kind of branch the need for folks who may not be able to access their lawmakers super easily. Again, both paths are very important, and we want to see robust funding for both. And we'll, of course, this year in fiscal year 2025, push for greater funding for community facilities and other rural development programs. So thanks for the note there. An important piece of this discussion.
Good. Question on the topic of broadband. Has there been any discussion or concern about the risk of broadband equity access and deployment, or BEAD program funds, of being frozen or changed with the new administration? This is obviously for Illinois a pretty important topic, since we've got over $1 billion worth of BEAD funding currently pending.
Yeah, it's a great question, and totally echo the concerns there. We're still waiting on full guidance when it comes to the future of the BEAD program. Something that gives us hope here is that rural development, broadband, and broadband investments generally are pretty bipartisan. And in Congress, we've seen a lot of support for many of the broadband programs that were created or reinvested in under the Biden administration, including from Republican offices that have a lot of control over the purse strings for these programs moving forward. So again, still waiting on federal guidance on those programs. It's certainly a fluid time right now. We're going to continue to track this, but we are certainly reassured by the fact that many Republicans in Congress are supportive of those programs. So more to come there. I'm sorry I can't give you a full answer on the future of that program.
Well, and you're right. Perhaps we should do an update 5 months from now for level setting. Here's an observation. There are regular improvements on the effectiveness of solar panels. I don't understand how solar is more important than farmland growing our food. That's kind of a broad policy level question, or observation.
Yeah, Adriana, thank you for that observation there. To answer your question, yeah, I mean, solar has made really leaps and bounds in the last couple of years as far as its efficiency, as well as the supply chain that makes these actual projects cheaper to make. I mean, most folks these days recognize that on a 10-year basis, renewable energy, including solar, is more cost effective than traditional fossil fuel energy generation, which is exciting to see. And that's a big reason why we've seen the increase in development recently, as well, along with federal supports for that energy. I think the concern here more is that there's no guidelines in place from the federal side on where these projects can be sited. Again, many rural communities and many communities generally are really supportive of that kind of investment. And we certainly want to empower our own members to pursue whatever energy solution they want for their own communities. But we would just appreciate seeing some action on the federal side to make sure that we aren't putting these solar panels on the most productive ag land right now. So again, we're just looking for guidelines here, not looking to stop these investments necessarily, but I think more cooperation between the solar industry, between local governments and our federal partners can lead to a more balanced approach for how we're siting and pursuing these projects.
Sticking with the energy theme, there's a question/observation from Jamie. Why isn't nuclear energy a bigger part of the discussion for renewable energy?
Yeah, Jamie, great question. I'm actually not an expert on nuclear energy myself, but what I will say is there's been an increasing amount of private sector interest in nuclear. I don't know how many of you all are following the developments around AI right now, but many technology companies are actually directly investing in old nuclear plants and new nuclear facilities. Well, that's certainly a big part of the discussion there, and that wouldn't surprise me if that will be followed by additional action on the federal side to make it easier to site and ultimately construct many of these projects. So again, I can't give a full update on where nuclear sits in with many of these other renewable energy solutions, but it's certainly on the table, and I expect it to get more attention moving forward here.
Going to jump down a couple questions to stick with the energy theme for just a moment. Maggie asks, how will the process of developing county level best practices for renewable energy evolve, and what is the timeline?
Sure, Maggie, great question. Again, this issue area is often so new and the kind of upswell and opposition to many of these projects is so new that we're still kind of in fact-finding mode, at least on NACo's side right now. There's certainly a whole lot of research being done in the academy. There's plenty of universities that have been researching this issue themselves, as well as industry. For us at NACo, we're trying to invest a lot of money bringing on new staff to look into this issue ourselves, kind of see what the landscape really looks like at the county level. You know, how many counties are opposing this stuff? How are they opposing them? What are the main sources of opposition? And we're hoping that'll lead to, in partnership with USDA and the solar industry, a better understanding of what those best practices are. So again, early in this process, but I do know that on many fronts, there is a lot of research going into that very question.
Stacy offers a question also related to the solar issue on the mechanics of kind of developing the information necessary to evaluate the various costs and benefits of solar versus other applications for the land. Can farmers report how much money they make per acre growing corn and beans versus how much per acre in their leases from solar companies who pay for the use of that land?
Stacy, great question. The answer is kind of a mixed one there. By and large, we have studies that kind of show what the value is when it comes to solar projects writ large across the entire industry, when it comes to the rents or the leases they're paying to farmers. And then we also have data at often the county level with what they're getting from producing corn and beans on their land or any other crops. I don't have a good answer for you right now on the trade-off from place to place, and often, of course, that differs based on the utility we're talking about that's developing the offer on the table, and then, of course, the local market conditions for farmers. Of course, if you email me, I'd be happy to follow up, and maybe I can find you some better data there. I know the USDA's Economic Research Service might have some good information for you on that topic.
We'll shift a bit. Abigail offers a historical observation, poses a question. SS4A action plans were required under the previous administration to have an equity component. Now those communities are applying for implementation grants using those plans that have equity built in. Do you foresee them having issues?
Abigail, I don't want to speculate too much on the direction the administration is going when it comes to any kind of federal funding that has an equity component built in. Anecdotally, I've heard a lot of stories about how programs might be shifting the way they score applications to reflect kind of a movement away from centering DEI initiatives in funding decisions. Again, I don't want to say one way or the other on these particular programs and how they might impact grantees. I would encourage them as soon as possible to get in touch with their federal partners who are implementing this grant for some more clarification there.
Good answer on that, Owen. I'll just note that Holly has provided some useful information on her organization and some links that might be of interest for some of our visitors today. Moving further down, again, Andrew offers a number of useful soil data and state cooperative extension links for the region. And I think that's it. We've got, again, a number of Holly's repeated the information quite a bit. And feel free to drop further questions into the chat. I did have one that relates to the rural health theme, Owen, and in particular, are the federal funds that are supporting the rural health initiatives, with the exception of the Medicare funds, obviously, all covered under the Farm Bill, or is there other legislation that covers rural health that's not part of that humongous Farm Bill financial package?
Mike, great question. There's actually surprisingly very little rural health programs that are authorized through the Farm Bill. There's a few and increasingly more in the last, I think, 2 Farm Bill cycles. There was a rural health policy liaison role that was authorized under USDA's umbrella. there. However, most rural health programs are actually run through the Health and Human Services Administration that has a whole bunch of other authorizing legislation that works on those programs. And any action we'll see on rural health this Congress likely won't come through the Senate or House Ag committees. It'll come through other jurisdictions as well. So there's a possibility that we see some more health action, especially on the telehealth piece when it comes to broadband investments authorized through the Farm Bill, in the Farm Bill this year. But we'll likely see that action take place in kind of other arenas within Congress this year.
Interesting. Thank you. We have another question, but I think it may already have been answered. How does it affect broadband grant development to rural farm areas with respect to BEAD? And you kind of touched on those ripples earlier as you addressed the BEAD. Another observation related to the rural healthcare EMS discussion, we are seeing challenges related to volunteer rural fire departments, in addition to ambulance services, particularly with the number and availability of volunteers. Mental health access and providers are also a significant concern. So an observation about their on-the-ground experiences.
100% A to Z. I'm not sure what your full name is there, but just a quick comment on that. The behavioral health piece, I didn't really get a chance to acknowledge fully today, but that's a really, really important part of the rural health policy discussion right now. A lot of urban communities have been really forward thinking when it comes to behavioral health services in their communities and building out capacity to deliver those services. But often with capacity challenges in rural communities, that hasn't been at the forefront of the discussion there. That being said, we are seeing more and more rural communities be really innovative with their approach to behavioral health systems and outreach. And often that's been partnered with some really creative approaches to how we're rethinking kind of regionalizations of different healthcare models to provide more resources to a larger area, or kind of integrating continuum of care services with traditional healthcare to make sure that there's a warm handoff between folks who are maybe experiencing a behavioral health challenge in their community to more of the traditional healthcare system that hasn't really been in place in the past in rural communities. So exciting things that are happening here. If you want more information on how rural healthcare is responding to behavioral health needs, I would encourage you to look on NACo.org. We got some great resources on that, and would of course be happy to share those with you over email if that would be helpful.
Thanks, Owen. I'm going to take a moment here and ask, while we still have a good crowd here, we're going to put up a quick one-question poll. If you wouldn't mind taking a second to respond, it helps us understand how effective our presentations are and our ability to increase awareness of the material being covered. So that question, and William, I apologize if I overlooked you. I may have missed it, but is there a way to classify, quote, prime, close quote, farmland to preserve it?
Yeah, great question. I actually think one of the commenters kind of highlighted a couple ways that that's being considered. One of which is looking at soil health. There's the USDA has a great way to classify crop yields and soil health and kind of its relation with crop productivity, including some really detailed maps as a GIS nerd that I love looking at myself. That's one possible way that you can reclassify what counts as prime farmland. Ultimately, though, that has to be decided through the programs that we're talking about through legislation. That's actually something we're working on right now and are working with partners to really develop what a good framework is for what counts as prime farmland, what counts as marginal farmland, and how that would interact with maybe potential solar energy siting practices.
Thank you. Next one we've got from Holly asking, Owen, is NACo working on the possibility of Medicaid cuts at all and how that may impact rural areas? Illinois has trigger language that would disenroll our expanded population automatically if the federal match drops below 90%.
Oh, Holly, first of all, I didn't realize that Illinois had that language in place. That's certainly concerning. We are focusing on really pushing back against any Medicaid cuts that we might see through the government this year. Obviously, Medicaid expansion has been a big win for healthcare provisions all across the country, and making sure that folks have adequate access to Medicare or Medicaid is really, really important for NACo generally. That space is evolving, and we'll likely see some action on that through the reconciliation process this year. And NACo's incorporated into our advocacy priorities that we want to protect Medicaid and Medicare services.
Now, here's an interesting one. LaDonna asks, are you getting any sense of movement on a federal budget or CR by the March 14th deadline? Or are there chances of a shutdown?
Oh man, LaDonna, that is the $1 million question right now, isn't it? The answer is somewhat. I would have hoped that we would have seen more action, particularly from the House that typically starts this process. They haven't really released a framework for their budget just yet, which is concerning given we're 6 weeks away from that deadline. We've actually heard some frustrations voiced in the last day or two from Senate appropriations leaders saying that the House doesn't take steps, they'll move first to try to get this process rolling. I'm Again, there's a lot of time between then and now for this stuff to develop. We would have loved to see more action already, but I think it's too soon to say whether we're increasing or decreasing the chances of a shutdown. Other than to say that the more time we go without a set plan in place for reconciliation and appropriations, we're generally increasing that likelihood that will happen.
And we'll wait 6 weeks and see where we are then, right?
Exactly. Unfortunately, we're in wait and see mode.
Have a request for a clarifying question going back to the energy theme. Does the push for best practices in renewables only focus on solar, or will initiatives also focus on best practices at the county level for wind energy? How can we get involved?
Yeah, Maggie, great question. Most of my presentation today did focus on solar, given that it has the largest footprint on agriculture right now in prime farmland. Wind can be often cited elsewhere that isn't just farmland, but because of the massive footprint you do need for solar and often the interaction between what's most productive when it comes to solar arrays hitting on a photovoltaic panel and what it takes for crop growth, they're often co-located. They're often the same place. We're also looking at certainly best practices for wind energy. We've actually been taking part at NACo in a couple of federal grants from DOE relating to best practices on solar and wind power. Those grants are actually up in the air right now. They've actually been caught up in the some concerns right now surrounding the federal funding freeze. That being said, if you want to get involved with that process on NACo's end or with some of our partners, we'd be happy to answer some questions there via email if that works for you.
Terrific. I think we've got time for one last question. We're starting to bump up on the end of our time, but we've got a question from one of my colleagues up here in Northwestern Illinois. Heather, thanks for the question. Can you clarify, is the threat to the tax-exempt status of municipal bonds retroactive or to existing bonds or only moving forward?
Hey, Heather, great question. I'm not an expert on this, and I can't get you a full answer right now. What I can say is I believe a lot of that will depend on the approach that legislators take in the any potential tax package. I'm not sure to what extent they could apply that retroactively, but certainly muni bonds going forward may be targeted, or the tax exempt status of those bonds may be targeted. Would be happy to circle back with you on that question and connect you with my colleague who works specifically on tax issues.
All righty. And with that, we are reaching the end of our time together. But I do, on behalf of the University of Illinois Extension, want to thank Owen and NACo for Owen's presentation today. As I mentioned earlier, if you registered for the webinar, you will receive the presentation materials and a link to the recording in a follow-up email. If you didn't register, again, that's okay. Just before you leave, drop your email into the chat box so we can add you to the mailing list. If you're not already receiving our email notices about upcoming webinar offerings, please drop your email into the chat before you go with a note to add you to the mailing list, and we'll get you onto that mailing list, which is now over 9,000 strong. For example, coming up on Tuesday, February 11th, again at high noon, you can join us for the next presentation in our Thriving Communities webinar series on strategies to build resilience with the BRIC grant, green infrastructure, and hazard mitigation planning. Also coming up on February 20th at noon is the first installment of our Federal Interagency Disaster Series on FEMA Interagency Recovery Coordination. I would also invite you to go visit our website at go.illinois.edu/LGE to access our video archives of prior presentations on a wide variety of community development topics. So with that, thank you all for attending today's webinar. Have a great day, and we hope to see you back for future presentations. Thanks so much.